My name is Michael Roth. I'm the president and a professor at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. Welcome to my exp. I teach a course called Virtue and Vice in Literature, History, and Philosophy. And we begin with Confucius, and we end with Spike Lee and Maggie Nelson and Daniel Allen. And the course is really about the idea of virtue and how it changes over time. And I really do want my students to have a sense of what Aristotle meant by moderation, or what Aquinas meant by beatitude, or Machiavelli by virtuosity. That's important to me. I really want them to learn from the text. But it's even more important for me that they learn about virtue as something they can practice outside of class. So in this particular class, we take a virtue every week. They happen to be from Ben Franklin's list of virtues, which conveniently fit into the semester. And they develop a practice that week in their lives related to that virtue. Philosophy gives you a series of techniques and a canon of texts that help you reflect on what you're doing with your life, what you're doing with your society, what if you know the things you know, those kinds of questions, I do think enrich one's life. And another aspect of philosophy that I do think can make your life better and also can make your community better is when philosophy cultivates intellectual humility. When philosophy, because of our confrontation with our own ignorance and our capacity for wonder, when philosophy leads you to listen to other people more carefully because you realize you don't have the answers yourself. I asked my students at the very beginning of the class, this virtue class, every year, I asked them, who is your moral hero? Which surprises them. You know, many of them they've never thought about that question. And I asked them to write it down and send it to me. So they don't have to say it out loud in front of everyone, but they do have to say, I know who they are, and what they've said. And I actually took this from a philosopher, Elizabeth Minnick, a great public philosopher here in the United States. She told me about doing this with her older students in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I've been doing it for years, and I was really surprised when the students came back and said, my mother, my father, my grandparents. Overwhelmingly, the category that chosen most often as for moral hero by my students were parents and grandparents. And I said to the students, this was unthinkable for my generation. You know, I'm 64. When I was in college, the idea that you would say your parents are your moral heroes is just, I love my parents, I love them and all, but I would never say that. And the students then were very insulted. They said, well, that's because our parents are better than your parents. and I remember one student saying to me, my mother is a rebel. And I'm just like my mother, I'm a rebel. And I was like, well, she's really convinced you to be a conformist and think you're a rebel. And, we get into these conversations. But what they begin to reveal is what they value in another person at the level of morality. A few things come to the fore: generosity and the capacity to overcome suffering. And overcome is a very general word. The capacity to survive suffering, which for me is extremely interesting because this course is built, this Virtue and Vice course is built on a a narrative arc where we go, starting in the ancient world, where virtue is tied to a certain kind of strength or even good luck and health, toward the end of the class, where virtue is tied to having suffered, being a survivor, gives you a kind of moral status, especially in the United States these days. Being a survivor elevates you. Whereas in the ancient world, it was, it's tough luck to have had to become a survivor, but it wasn't the key to moral elevation. Certainly Christianity is a big piece of this puzzle, but I think in the United States over the last probably 40 years or so, the notion that you've suffered and so that you've learned something important about morality and you've survived, and that becomes a moral category, right? You're not a victim, you're a survivor. And the survivor is ennobled in much of popular culture in the United States. So we talk about that and examine that and try to understand, if we think about it, if that's something that seems to us to be sensible.